So, Danila, being from Latvia, I just cannot comprehend why all the Baltic states have such an extremely misguided anti-Russian mentality within them, to the point where it's beyond just poking the bear. It's essentially three tiny poodles barking at the enormous bear that lives right next to them. And not just any bear. This bear has nuclear weapons in one hand and large amounts of resources that we need to live properly in the other. And yet they just keep barking. It boggles my mind. Any thoughts on this? Well, I don't have any explanations because I don't pretend to know the Baltic states very well. I'm sure that history has played a role. I mean, they were occupied by the Soviet Union, but rationally, they ought to be making precisely the decisions which you say. I have always said that for the Baltic states to take this approach to antagonize this giant neighbor is misguided. The right policy is to try and work out a sustainable, friendly relationship with it, and not to rely excessively on the United States, which is far away and may one day decide that it's got other more important things to worry about than the Baltic states, but instead to worry about and to work things out with the giant next door. But why, even allowing for the history, I still find it very strange that as the people in the Baltic states take this to the extremes that they do. And I have to say that I do wonder whether one particular reason is that this extremely anti-Russian policy that they follow isn't partly because they feel that it makes them important within Europe. It makes the Europeans listen to the Baltic states in ways that they might not otherwise do. In other words, it's a way of gaining attention, very dangerous way of gaining attention, but I wonder whether that might have something to do with it. But as somebody from the Baltic states, perhaps you can set out your own thoughts. So Sats 8, I've heard that every time the music stops, they take another chair out of the UK cabinet room. Absolutely. And you probably know that we've just lost our Home Secretary, close associate and friend of Liz Truss and political ally until today. And now, of course, she's gone. And I can't help but think that this particular scandal, and JJHW asks me the same question. What do I make of the Home Secretary resigning? I think it's part of the same plot that we've been talking about for some time, in the sense that she did transgress. She sent a government document via a private email. And as we know from the Hillary Clinton affair, you're not supposed to do that. But it's the sort of thing where in former times, a minister who'd been caught doing that would be taken to task, would have a meeting with the cabinet secretary, a meeting with the prime minister, would promise not to do it again. Instead, we see the Home Secretary being pushed into resigning. And of course, bear in mind that since this was a private email, somebody must have seen that email and leaked it to the security services and to the civil service. So I can't help but think that the Home Secretary was deliberately targeted. She's been picked off because she's another ally or possible ally of Liz Truss. She's another member of the Truss Quarteng, if you like, Brexit group. I put Brexit in inverted commas because I don't think Truss actually is much of a Brexiter. But I think that for all those reasons, I think she's been picked off. They're gradually picking off one by one all the members of the cabinet who are seen by Britain's permanent state as unreliable. Ilya Kuryakin says that the lettuce will win. I think the lettuce is what people talk about, the permanent state. It is winning. And I wouldn't call it a lettuce, by the way. I would call it a deadly nightshade, because that's what it is. It's spreading and it's killing everybody that stands in its way. And Scott Font, you're very welcome. So, Merry Democrat. I feel compelled to admit that I wouldn't possibly follow your views on Kwarteng. From the WF's point of view, he did well by subsidizing households because by doing so, he finally could transfer the QE-induced inflation from the monetary wholesale circuit to the monetary retail circuit and even circumvent the retail banks. Our split-circuit monetary system was being crashed by Corona in 2020, which followed a BlackRock strategic report of August 2019, dealing with the next downturn. I didn't say that Davos, the WEF, were cross with Kwarteng. What I hope I made clear in the recent video that we did is why I personally disagreed with the policy. I think that trying to sustain demand by paying people's energy bills, households' energy bills, not only is a colossal market distortion, but it is bound to lead to higher inflation. That's my objection to Kwarteng, my dear friend Kwarteng's mini budget. Well, the WEF thinks I have absolutely no idea. I suspect that they're not particularly keen, not so much on Kwarteng. I think they'd have been perfectly happy with Kwarteng. He's been to all the right schools, universities. He's not a person, as I said, with any very strong opinions about these things, contrary to what you hear. I think they'd have been perfectly happy with Kwarteng. But I don't think they trust Liz Truss to retain control of what is becoming an increasingly dangerous for them situation in Britain. They want someone who's prepared to take tough action against protests, against strikes, against that sort of thing. And they think that Liz Truss is not the person for that. And I think they know who that person that they want is. And it's no one within the Conservative Party. It is Keir Starmer. That is my underlying analysis. Satsay, what do I think of Macron's parallel EU? Is he smart enough to see the direction of travel and thinks it's a chance for him to be the emperor of something? Well, I think that's part of it. And I think he is smart enough to see the direction of travel. But, and this is the problem with Macron, he has these moments of insight. He sometimes says the right things, but deep down, he is a committed globalist. He is a fervid Europeanist. He may not like certain aspects of, the Anglo-American power system, but he's not ultimately a rebel. And he doesn't know how to be. He doesn't have the ability to forge coalitions, to find friends, to build up an alternative structure that is viable and strong. He's not that kind of leader at the end of the day. And look how isolated he is, in Europe, with lots of countries in Europe mistrusting him, and how isolated he is increasingly becoming in France. I mean, one gets the sense all the time that, yes, he still has some support, but that all the major forces in France are starting to become tired of him and are turning on him. So it won't work in the end. So let's see, 50 miler. Isn't the UK non-Brexit, as is emerging, as potentially dangerous as the Irish Home Rule Bill, Government of Ireland Act 1914, which got sidelined in the name of the First World War, with all the 1916 Dublin events and the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War that followed after the First World War? My goodness, you are extremely well informed about British history, and you're quite right. I actually think the situation is more dangerous, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that the crisis in 1914 was a crisis in Ireland. It was not a crisis in England itself. Now, I want to make this clear. If you reel back in time to the Edwardian era, you would know that Edwardian Britain, Edwardian England, was not the placid, happy place that you sometimes believe. There was a lot of industrial unrest. The Labour Party was rising. There was concerns about the direction of the economy. The British establishment was nervous about its grip on the empire. There were the first murmurings of trouble in India. And of course, on top of that, there was a split within the political class between the Liberals, led by Asquith and Lloyd George, and, by the way, Winston Churchill. He was a Liberal in those days, who thought that the way out was through some process of reform, and others, the more conservatives, who felt that the right thing to do was to basically clamp down and to try to keep control. So there were tensions in Britain. I don't think they come anywhere close to that sense of tension and indeed collapse that we're starting to see in Britain today. I discussed this in a recent video I've done for my channel. I'm going to repeat it here. I've been reading the last couple of days the British media. It seems to me that over the last 3 days, that was the moment when the British political class finally understood how deep the crisis in Britain, not the crisis in Westminster, the crisis in Britain has become, and they have no answers. So I think actually the situation is more dangerous than it was in 1914. And of course, in 1914, the events that you spoke about led to a civil war in Ireland. I don't think we'll get a civil war in Britain, but severe unrest, I think, is a possibility. Rus Imperialist, one point to add to the explanation for Putin's words in Astana: demolishing Ukrainian state is not the goal of the SMO, but it can easily become one of the means of achieving stated goal of it. If the only way to achieve denazification and demilitarization, what can Putin do? I completely agree. I accept that point entirely. I think I said in one of my videos that destroying the Ukrainian state is not Russian policy. It's not their policy at the moment, but it is now a possibility that the Russians, for the first time, are not ruling out. And that is a huge conceptual change. Zapatilla, is it a way back for cooperation between Russia and Germany? Some kind of cooperation. Right, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. Even if there was a sudden shift in mood in Germany, even if the political system there changed, if the government collapsed, if a new government came in, let's say they brought Angela Merkel or even Gerhard Schröder back. The problem is that after seeing what has happened, the Russians don't trust this relationship with Germany anymore. And that's part of the significance of the Turkish gas hub idea. The Russians are saying, Germany, we've really seen trying to do business with these people is impossible. No chance of it in the future. Even if they come back and tell us, let's go back to where we were, we don't trust them. We got a working relationship with Turkey. Erdogan is a difficult man, but at least we know where he's coming from. And let's build these pipelines to Turkey instead. So Turkey becomes the gas hub instead of Germany, and the relationship recalibrates, and Germany remains out in the cold. So let's see others. Medi1, can someone explain to me how Boris Johnson, who was just removed, is still even in British government and could possibly be back? He's not in the British government, as I understand it. He's a backbencher. He's an MP. But he does have his friends. He does talk to them. He does have some influence still, I suspect, in the Conservative Party. And I don't doubt at all that he's whispering to people, or at least his friends are, that, you know, all these problems have been caused because Boris, who at least won the election in 2019, was removed, and let's find some way of sorting things out by bringing him back. So I think, he does have influence. I don't think that influence should be exaggerated. I don't think he's a particularly powerful figure anymore. I think that the Conservatives don't seem to be looking to him at the moment. Asphalios, Kalispera. Will Turkish pressure rid us of the dynastic Hellephone regimes, or will we have to wait for this to happen along with the rest of the EU? If you mean the Hellephone regimes, the dynastic regimes, the various families that have dominated Greek politics for as long as anybody can remember, and to one of which I belong. I should say perhaps belong is not the right word, because we no longer play an active role in Greek politics. We did 20 years ago, but we don't anymore. Well, if they all go, if this Turkish pressure does cause that fundamental change in Greek politics, does open up the Greek politics, does remove these oligarchic elements there, which are utterly integrated into the globalist system, if it does bring to power in Greece people who really care about Greece, who care about the sovereignty of Greece and the future of Greece, well, that will be an entirely good thing. I have to say, I don't expect it. And like you, I'm afraid I don't think it's going to change until the EU itself is gone. I think that these people who control Greek politics are part of the EU system. They draw their strength from the EU system. The EU system has to break down before they finally quit the scene. Danila, would I say that the recent pipeline sabotage will eventually start sentiments of growing distrust and animosity towards the US throughout the whole of Europe, leading to a sort of independence of US influence, similar in ways to the US's independence of 1776? Or would Europe always be wrapped under the US's thumb? I'm going to say what I think about this. I think it will increase eventually distrust and animosity towards the US. I think that the European political class, the elite, know that very well, which is why they won't conduct a proper investigation and tell us what actually happened. So I think that is the case. But I don't get the sense that we're in anything like a 1776 moment. 76 moment built up over a long time. But ultimately, it was an action of a people in the 13 colonies who were feeling increasingly confident, who felt that they were getting strong and that they could go their own way. And it's not the sentiment in Europe anymore. And it seems to me that there's two possible outcomes to this. One is that the United States itself might tire of Europe. And I think that's a real possibility. I think if you listen to people like Robert Barnes and others like him, I think that there is a sentiment in the United States that the United States has been involved in European affairs for far too long. It needs to mind its own affairs instead. And I think that opinion in the United States is growing stronger, and it might indeed prove decisive, so that it could be the United States that ultimately severs this connection. The other possibility, I'm afraid, is societal collapse in Europe. In other words, that the tensions in Europe will boil over, but because the political class closes off alternative options, we will have an overwhelming crisis. There's always a chance, a hope that someone somewhere, maybe in France now, the most likely country I'd have thought, might come forward and lead us in a different way. But for the moment, I don't see it. Jerry D, I was right about the Yellow Vests being much less of a threat than current strike and protests. Police vastly outnumbered and pushback seemed more token than anything else. At times, many even looked scared. It's strange, but maybe the French are doing the Germans' dirty work for them. Unlikely as it may be, if sanctions are rolled back at all, it will be a victory affecting the whole of Europe, Germany in particular. Absolutely. I agree with every point you've made. They're very good and insightful points. The only qualifier I would reiterate is that I'm not sure. I don't think we can return to the status quo ante. Even if a new German government, an AfD-led government, comes along to Moscow and says, let's go back to where we were, let's reopen all the Nord Stream pipelines, let's repair them, let's accept that you were right all along over Ukraine, let's do all of those things. I think that the Russians, seeing what has happened in Europe over the last few months, will never commit to Europe in the same way again. And that will inevitably reduce and limit Europe's options. Zarel, did I by any chance read my comment in our locals thread about Ben Wallace? He's in the USA with Austin, and do you think he's a primary candidate for PM? Now, this is very interesting, Zarel, because up to about 2 days ago, it really did look as if there was a groundswell of opinion within the Conservative Party. I don't say everybody within the Conservative Party, but that there were quite a lot of people who were saying Ben Wallace is the man. We need Ben Wallace. Most people like him. Most people trust him. He is in charge of the military. He's utterly reliable on Russia. He's somebody we can package and can take over. He looks like a steady pair of hands. And then he himself appeared to lend support to that. He said that the option of one day becoming prime minister was a real one and that he was prepared to contemplate it. And then suddenly we got further details that he isn't actually a candidate. He doesn't want to be involved in these political struggles at the moment. He doesn't want to be prime minister. And I have to say that this mysterious dash for Washington looks like an escape. It doesn't look like Wallace going to meet Austin to conspire with him. It looks rather like Wallace trying to find some reason not to be in London as everything falls apart. And one point which I think you did pick up on, but which I do want to repeat to people, a very odd, extremely strange explanation that Wallace has gone to Washington, is flying to Washington because communications are no longer trusted. In other words, if Wallace wants to talk to Austin over the telephone, the line is no longer secure. That's utterly bizarre and very extraordinary. But as I said, I think that it's principally about he's making this dash to get himself out of London at a time when he knows that there's a crisis underway. And I think he's deliberately putting himself away from the scene so that as the plotting intensifies, he's not caught up in it.